I was sitting in a lawyer's office in downtown Halifax when my brother-in-law slid a document across the table and told me to sign away everything my father-in-law had left behind. My hands weren't shaking. I was past shaking. I was somewhere beyond that. Numb in the way you get when you've been crying for 3 days straight, and your body just runs out of the ability to feel anything at all. The room smelled like old coffee and carpet cleaner. Outside the window, it was raining the way it only rains in November in Nova Scotia. Gray and relentless, and without any drama, just steady and cold, and completely indifferent to everything happening inside that office. My husband sat beside me. He wasn't looking at me. He'd barely looked at me in 2 weeks. His brother. I'll call him my brother-in-law because that's what he was, even if he never acted like it. Had his hands folded on the table like a man who had already won and was just waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. And I almost signed. My name is Audrey. I'm 34 years old. I grew up in Dartmouth, married a man I loved completely, and spent the better part of a decade building a life with him. I say all of this because I need you to understand what was at stake that afternoon. Not money, not property, not the numbers on those documents. What was at stake was whether I would walk out of that office still believing in the man I had married. Whether our marriage was real, or whether I had spent 10 years loving a version of my husband that existed mostly in my own imagination. I found out the truth that day, but not in the way I expected. My father-in-law, Arthur, passed away in September. He was 71. Lung cancer, diagnosed late. The kind of diagnosis that gives you just enough time to say goodbye, but not enough time to fix everything you should have fixed years ago. He and I had always gotten along well. Better than well, actually. He used to call me the daughter he never had, which I always thought was a little hard on my sister-in-law, but she never seemed to mind. Arthur was old-fashioned in the best possible way, stubborn and opinionated and deeply, genuinely loving once he decided he cared about you. He had a small business, a landscaping and property maintenance company he'd built from nothing, starting with a single truck and a used riding mower back in 1987. By the time he died, he had 14 full-time employees, contracts with 3 commercial property companies across HRM, and a reputation in the industry that took 35 years to build. It wasn't a huge enterprise by any measure. But it was his, every piece of it. He left it to my husband, not to my brother-in-law, not split between both sons. To my husband, specifically, with a note in the will explaining that he believed my husband had the temperament for long-term stewardship and that his other son, the brother-in-law, had already received a significant financial gift when Arthur helped him purchase his house in Bedford years earlier. I know this because Arthur told me himself 2 weeks before he died. We were sitting in the living room of his house in Eastern Passage, and he was tired in that specific way that sick people get. Not sleepy, just depleted, like the effort of existing had become something that required concentration. He told me he'd updated his will. He told me my husband was getting the business. He told me he hoped we would keep it running, even if we eventually decided to hire a manager and step back ourselves. He said, "Audrey, I trust you to look after things." And then he closed his eyes and we sat together in silence for a while, listening to the rain on the windows. He died 9 days later. What happened after the funeral was not what I expected. My brother-in-law arrived at the house the day after the burial. He was calm. Too calm, in the way my husband sometimes gets when something is wrong, but he hasn't decided how to handle it yet. He sat down with my husband in the kitchen and I was upstairs changing, but I could hear the low murmur of their voices. Not the words, just the rhythm. The way a conversation sounds when something serious is being negotiated. After he left, my husband was different. It's hard to explain how someone can change and stay exactly the same on the surface. He still made dinner. He still asked how my day went. He still kissed me goodnight. But there was a distance behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. Like he was running a second conversation in his head at all times, one I wasn't invited into. I asked him what was wrong. He said nothing. I asked again, different ways, different moments, different approaches. casually over breakfast, directly after dinner. Gently at 2 in the morning when we were both lying awake, and the pretending was harder to sustain. Every time, nothing. He was fine. There was nothing to talk about. He just needed some time to process losing his father. I believed him for about 3 weeks. Then I found the folder. I wasn't snooping. Not because it would change anything, but because it matters to me. I was looking for the car insurance documents because our renewal was coming up, and I thought I'd seen them in the filing cabinet in the den. I went through 3 drawers before I found what I was looking for, and then I found the other folder underneath a stack of old tax returns with my brother-in-law's name written in my husband's handwriting on the tab. Inside it were printed emails, bank statements, a letter from a financial advisor I'd never heard of, and a draft agreement, not the final version, just a working draft, outlining the terms of a buyout, my husband selling the business to my brother-in-law for significantly less than it was worth, for a number that made my stomach drop when I read it, because I knew enough about the company's revenue to know it wasn't even close. I stood in the den for a long time holding those papers. I didn't confront him that night. I don't know why. Maybe because I wasn't ready to hear the explanation. Or maybe because some part of me already suspected that the explanation was going to break something that couldn't be put back together. I went to bed. I lay there in the dark next to my husband, who was asleep or pretending to be, and I stared at the ceiling and thought about Arthur telling me he trusted me to look after things. I spent the next week making phone calls I probably should have made sooner. I spoke to a friend who works in commercial real estate and understands business valuations. I spoke to the family's longtime accountant, Gordon, who had worked with Arthur for almost 20 years, and who, when I told him what I'd found in the folder, went very quiet for a moment before he said, "Audrey, that number isn't right. That number is less than half of what that business is worth on paper." I asked Gordon if he knew about any of this. He said he hadn't been consulted. He said, in the careful way that someone speaks when they're choosing words deliberately, that he had received some unusual requests in the previous weeks, requests to pull certain the context until now. But that he hadn't understood the context until now. I asked him who had made those requests. He said, my brother-in-law. I need to tell you something about my brother-in-law because I want you to understand that I'm not describing a cartoon villain. He was charming. He coached his son's hockey team. He made excellent ribs at every summer barbecue and always remembered how everyone took their coffee. He was the kind of person who gives toasts at weddings that make people laugh and then tear up, sometimes within the same sentence. I liked him. I had liked him for 10 years. But he had a history with money that I only understood in pieces. A business that had failed in his mid-20s. A period in his early 30s where things had been tight in a way that Arthur had quietly helped with. The house in Bedford, which Arthur had funded substantially. And underneath all of it, a relationship with his brother, my husband, that I had always read as affectionate rivalry, but which, looking at it now, had a different shape entirely. My husband had always deferred to him, always smoothed things over, always been the one to back down when the two of them disagreed about anything, because he hated conflict in a way that went deeper than preference. It was almost reflexive, that backing down, like a habit formed so early it had become invisible. My brother-in-law knew that. He had always known that. The meeting in the lawyer's office had been my brother-in-law's suggestion. He framed it as settling the estate efficiently, which sounded reasonable and responsible, and also, I now understood, was designed to happen quickly enough that no one would look too closely at the numbers before the signing. I went to that meeting, knowing what I knew. I hadn't told my husband about the folder yet. I'd thought about it 100 times. Every meal, every evening, every one of those nights lying awake in the dark. And each time I came up against the same wall. He already knew about the buyout. He was the one selling. Which meant either he was being manipulated in a way he couldn't see, or he was a willing participant in something that would cut the value of his father's legacy in half. I didn't know which was worse. The lawyer's office was on Barrington Street. Parking cost $17, which I paid, and somehow that small, stupid detail is what I remember most vividly about arriving. My husband held the door for me, and we didn't speak in the elevator. My brother-in-law was already there when we walked in, sitting at the head of the rectangular table with the estate lawyer beside him and a neat stack of documents in front of him that he had clearly arranged himself before we arrived. There was also someone else in the room. A woman, sitting in the chair along the wall, slightly apart from the table. I didn't recognize her at first. She was older, maybe early 60s, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a leather binder in her lap. She introduced herself when I asked. Her name was Helen, and she was the independent executor Arthur had appointed, separately from the family lawyer, to oversee the distribution of the estate. I hadn't known Arthur had appointed an independent executor. I hadn't known because I later understood no one had told me, or my husband. My brother-in-law's expression when he saw Helen was the first crack in the composure he'd been maintaining for 2 weeks. It was only a second, just a fraction of a second, where his face did something it wasn't supposed to do. And then it was gone, replaced by that easy smile. The meeting started. Documents were presented. My brother-in-law's lawyer explained the terms of the proposed transfer in language designed to sound routine. And for 10 minutes I sat there and let it happen, and watched my husband nodding along at things he clearly didn't fully understand, because he trusted his brother, because he always had, because backing down was the thing he knew how to do. And then I stopped it. I said, "Before anyone signs anything, I have a question for Helen." My brother-in-law looked at me. My husband looked at me. The estate lawyer looked at me. I asked Helen if she had reviewed the proposed sale price for the business as part of her duties as executor. Helen opened her leather binder. She said she had. She said that as part of her independent review, she had commissioned a market valuation of the business based on 3 years of financial statements, current contracts, and equipment assets. She said the figure in the draft agreement, the number I had found in the folder in the den, was $340,000. She said the independent valuation had come in at $810,000. The room went very still. My husband turned to look at his brother. My brother-in-law started to say something about the valuation methodology being subjective, about market conditions, about how the business had specific operational dependencies that reduced its transferability. He had clearly prepared for pushback. He had language ready. But the thing about a number like that, the thing about a gap that large, is that it's very hard to explain away in a room full of people who can do arithmetic. Helen said, calmly, that she had also found evidence of requests made to the company's accountant for financial documents, requests that had not been disclosed to the estate or to my husband as the named beneficiary. She said she was formally pausing the proceedings until a full review could be completed. My brother-in-law's composure was gone now. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't the kind of person who shouted, but his voice had changed, the way a voice changes when the performance underneath it starts to fail. He said this was between brothers. He said it was a family matter. He said I had no place interfering in something I didn't understand. My husband stood up. I had not expected that. In 10 years, I had never seen my husband stand up to his brother. I had seen him almost do it, 6 times. The breath before the sentence that never came, the thought behind the eyes that stayed behind the eyes. But he stood up, and when he spoke, his voice was very quiet and very clear. He said, "How long have you been planning this?" His brother didn't answer. My husband said, "She's my wife. This is my father's business. And this number is wrong, and you knew it was wrong, and you brought me here to sign it before I figured that out." His brother said something about how he was just trying to simplify things, about how managing a landscaping company wasn't really what either of them had wanted, about how this was the practical solution. My husband, "You could have asked me. You could have just asked me." And something in that sentence, the simplicity of it, I think, the way it reduced everything to what it actually was, made his brother go quiet. We didn't sign anything that day. Helen filed a formal report with the estate, and the matter was referred for further review. I won't walk you through all the legal steps that followed, because honestly, some of it, I still don't fully understand myself. Estate law in Nova Scotia is not casual reading, but the short version is this. The independent executor's report documented a pattern of financial records authorized and a proposed sale price that could not be justified by any reasonable valuation method. The matter was reviewed. My brother-in-law retained his own lawyer. My husband retained Gordon, the accountant, who had worked with his father for 20 years, and together they rebuilt an accurate picture of what the business was actually worth. The first conversation I had with my husband after we left that office was in the car, parked on Barrington Street in the rain. He didn't start the engine. We sat there for a while. He said he had known about the buyout. He said his brother had come to him the day after the funeral and told him that managing the business was going to be a burden, that it would take years and stress and resources they didn't have, that the practical thing, the thing their father would have wanted, actually, because Arthur had always hated seeing his son struggle, was to liquidate quickly and divide the proceeds. He said his brother had said I would be relieved, that I had never been comfortable with the idea of running a business, that I had confided this to my sister-in-law. I had never said anything of the kind. My husband said he hadn't verified it. He said he had just assumed it was true because his brother had said it with such certainty in the way he said everything, and because he stopped here and looked at the steering wheel and then looked at me, because it was easier to believe it than to ask me directly and find out it might not be. I want to be honest with you. That was the hardest part. Not the business, not the money, not the documents or the meeting or the number on the page. The hardest part was sitting in that car and understanding that my husband had made a decision that would have changed our lives, had spent weeks moving toward it, without once asking me what I thought, without once saying, "Here's what's happening, here's what I'm considering. What do you think, Audrey? What do you want?" He had locked me out. Not to hurt me. I believe that, now, more than I did sitting in that car. He locked me out because he had learned, somewhere long before I met him, that managing a situation meant managing it alone and presenting the results when it was done. That asking for help, even from a wife, was a form of weakness. That his brother was the authority on what was practical and what wasn't, and had been since they were kids. I told him all of that. I said it clearly and without shouting, which was harder than shouting would have been. He listened. He didn't try to explain it away or minimize it, or redirect to the business or his brother or anything else. He just listened, and when I finished, he said, "You're right, I'm sorry, that was wrong." 4 words and an apology. Insufficient, obviously. But it was real. I knew him well enough to know when he was performing and when he wasn't, and this was not a performance. I told him I wasn't ready to forgive him yet. I told him I needed him to understand that locking me out of something this significant wasn't a small thing, wasn't a communication quirk, wasn't something we could paper over with a good week and a nice dinner. I told him I needed to see it change. He nodded. He said he understood. We drove home in the rain. The months that followed were genuinely hard. I won't tell you they weren't, because that would be a kind of dishonesty I'm not interested in. Trust doesn't heal the way a cut heals, cleanly, in stages you can observe with a clear endpoint. It's more like, I don't know how to say this exactly, it's more like learning to walk again after you've hurt your knee. Some days it's fine. Some days you step wrong, and the whole thing flares up, and you're back to wondering if it will ever feel normal. My husband and my brother-in-law did not speak for 4 months. When they did, it was stilted and formal and nothing like how brothers talk. I don't know if that relationship will ever fully recover. I think it's possible it won't, and I've made my peace with that possibility in a way I couldn't have 2 years ago. My husband took over the business. He hired a general manager, a woman named Frances, who had worked in landscape operations for 15 years and knew every crew foreman by name within about 3 weeks of starting. My husband handles the client relationships and the contracts, which turns out to be exactly the part of it he's good at. Gordon stayed on as the accountant. On the first spring after Arthur died, my husband replanted the flower beds in front of their family home, the house in Eastern Passage where Arthur had lived for 30 years. Because Arthur had always done it himself and nobody else had thought to do it. Pansies in front, hostas along the side fence, one climbing rose that Arthur had been trying unsuccessfully to establish for a decade. My husband spent a full Saturday on it. I brought sandwiches and coffee, and we ate lunch on the front step, and he told me about the climbing rose, and why his father had been so stubborn about it, and I listened, and the afternoon light came through low and golden, the way it does in April in Nova Scotia, and it was one of the better days I can remember. Things are not perfect. I don't think they will be in the specific shape that perfect used to have in my mind, but they are honest. That's the thing I hold on to most. We are honest with each other now in a way we weren't before, partly because the alternative revealed itself so completely that autumn. What happens when you stop talking to the person you're supposed to be building a life with? What happens when you mistake silence for protection? Arthur used to say that the worst thing a person could do was make a decision for someone else without asking them first. He used to say it when he was giving advice about the business, about clients, about employees. But I think about it differently now. I think he understood something that took the rest of us longer to learn. I think about him every time I drive past the company's trucks. They still have his name on the side panels. My husband kept it that way. Said it felt right. It does.